The beginning of the 1940s, a new surge of black migrants would come to Chicago as the war industry would open up jobs for Americans. As the big rush to the north began in the 1940s, southern black families arriving soon found out the promised land was not all it cracked up to be, as an immediate housing shortage often stopped families dead in their tracks.
Here we have an opportunity that perhaps a lot of people will never get. But the joy is that we're all sharing as Mississippians and trying to say, in a nutshell, how glad we are from whence we came. We never regret it.
That's right. And I can remember the time when we couldn't even afford to ride on a bus. Now we can charter our own buses.
Many say that vice lords have origins that date back all the way to the 40s. However, this doesn't mean that any part of the nation was found back in the 40s. It just means that members from older gangs ended up flipping the vice lords in later years. The Vice Lord Nation is one of the largest gangs in the United States, with chapters in every state in the nation and almost every city and town in the country. The Vice Lord Nation has grown so powerful because of the goals the nation has tried to accomplish over time. Many think that it was all about drugs and money, but the real cause of the nation is not about drugs, money, or even violence. Much of this story is about violence, but the Vice Lords did not condone violence or criminal activity. This is one of the craziest stories I ever reported on. And the Vice Lords had a plan to take over the whole Chicago, and he was very close at accomplishing this, but failed at the end. In 1951, the Clovers and Chaplains migrated to the North Lawndale neighborhood, but were not a big-time gangbanging group until 1994. When the North Lawndale and near West Side neighborhoods began to set off with several fistfights. As territory was now being set, both of these gangs would take over the whole neighborhood as the big outfits in the community as the Sheiks and Shebas ended. North Lawndale was a neighborhood that became conquered by predatory slumlords in 1955, right after they purchased a vast majority of rental properties. It was 5 of them that became the most notorious slumlords, running below substandard properties to impoverish southern black families without maintaining the buildings. These families had no other choice but to live in these conditions because they couldn't afford anywhere else to go, and other mostly white neighborhoods were hostile towards black families. Even after the covenants was lifted, North Lawndale rapidly declined as many businesses closed and buildings became deteriorated in the mid-1950s. Also, crime began to run rampant as criminals from outside neighborhoods drifted in and wreaked havoc or committed hate crimes. Pre-existing youth clubs in the community soon converted into street gangs like Imperial Chaplains and Clovers. Plus, many more gangs were formed that were more violent breeds than the original Clovers and Chaplains. One such gang was the Egyptian Cobras that came to the North Lawndale neighborhood from the Maxwell Street Market area in 1955. It got to the point in the later 1950s where young black youths growing up in the North Lawndale neighborhood couldn't go anywhere or do anything without being in a gang. If you think that forced recruitment is harsh in the modern time, it was way worse back in the 50s and 60s. As gangs took ownership of every piece of public property on the west side, you couldn't go to the pool, the park, the theater, or even a grocery store without some gang harassing you. Even the young black youths had a hard time walking to school or going anywhere. It got to the point where youths needed to make a tough decision, and that was to join a gang. The real decision is what gang they wanted to join, and that all depended on what activities they wanted to get involved in. In the year of 1957, the gangs of North Lawndale and near the west side will reach a new level of violence, as gangs now began beating each other with weapons, like stabbing each other with knives or even shooting each other with guns. In the same year of 1957, the Clovers were a dominating gang in North Lawndale, along with the Egyptian Cobras, quickly growing just behind them. The Clovers were said to be one of the toughest gangs out there, and at the time they also ruled the Maxwell Street Market on Halstead. But the Clovers' toughness and dominance caught the attention of the Chicago police in March of 1957, which was mainly Clovers and Egyptian Cobras. The police began to beat these gang members badly and incarcerate them. Many cops would burn kids with cigarettes, whip them with belts, and even punch them in the face. This all led to the James Wholesale affair in May of 1957, with James Halsell, which he was a Clover, was charged with a very minor misdemeanor. Yet he was beat severely with a belt for 6 hours. This sparked an investigation from the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU. Plus the FBI got involved, including with the Executive Board of Chicago Youth Centers. Despite the investigations, the police sweeps continued into 1958, and several black youths were arrested, and many were sent to juvenile facilities. This would now be the start of the Vice Lords. During the sweeps of 1957 to 1958, a 15-year-old youth by the name of Edwin Perry, aka Pepperlo, and his group named the Phantom Burglars were arrested for burglary and brought to the Illinois Youth Center. In 1957, when Pepperlo was 14 years old, he left home and began living on his own, involved in a life of crime and mainly burglary though. This is where things would get crazy and the start of the Vice Lords will come out. Pepperlo wanted to become a member of one of the larger outfits at the time, the Imperial Chaplains. But when he went to their lair to speak to Big John, the leader of Chaplains, Big John told him, "We don't want no punk MFers in our organization." It is a mystery why Big John wouldn't let him in, since Pep was 6'1", 190 pounds, fast on his feet and with his hands. One thing for sure, Big John made a big mistake for not letting Pep in. But of course, if it wasn't for this chain of events, there would be no Vice Lords of today. After this all happened, Pep was assigned to stay at the Harding Cottage at the reformatory, and he found out his friend from the neighborhood, Leonard Calloway, aka Cal, was staying there as well. Pepperlo already had gained a reputation for being a good boxer and exhibited leadership qualities. He also was known for getting new guys in line when coming into the facility. Pep somehow arranged Cal to be transferred in his cottage, and the boys came together at the facility. Calloway was a member of the Imperial Chaplains and was Pep's sponsor to gain membership into the Chaplains. But of course, that didn't go as planned back in 1957. But now in 1958, the two were in this Harding facility together and decided to click up. They also clicked up with Ernest Wynn, who also was an Imperial Chaplain. These young men also came together with a guy named Toehold, Ralph Barnes, Maurice Miller, and one other guy that is unknown. Pep assembled this group of only 7 into their own organization, geared at organizing their work details and pulling strings to get jobs they favored. The jobs they worked were very important in the institution. This caused the 7 boys to end up running the whole Illinois Youth Center. And since the jobs were assigned by the institution, the staff didn't pay them any mind and let them carry on. The 7 boys didn't have a name in the very beginning, but Pep decided he wanted a name, especially since the boys were already running the important jobs there. Besides the relations between Cal and Pep, the boys were all strangers to each other. The boys had meetings twice a week, and at one of those meetings, they came up with a name. Pep wanted this club to be a gang once they returned to the streets. Maurice Miller, though, thought it was going to be a social club and came up with the idea, Conservative Lads. But Pep wanted a different last name, but decided to keep the conservative part in the name. The Vice Lords was the perfect name for them, created by Pep. He looked it up in a dictionary what vice meant, which was to have a tight grip on something and not let go. Then of course they would be lords. The idea from Wren and Cal were to be called Imperial Vice Lords, to pay tribute to the gang that they belonged to at the time. But to know that Pep had previously worked hard to join that gang, he had a vendetta against Big John and the Chaplains and wanted nothing to do with them. So he stuck with the name Conservative Vice Lords. But within a short time, they realized the conservative part didn't really make sense for them, and most people didn't even know the meaning of conservative. So they just stuck with Vice Lords. Maurice Miller was the first one to get out of the reformatory, and the deal was he was supposed to be the first one to spread the word about the Vice Lords to the streets. He was the first one to inform the streets about the Vice Lords. However, the nation was not really put out there until all of the boys got out that autumn of 1958. By the time the boys got out, the Clovers were no longer the biggest and meanest outfits anymore. Now, it was the Egyptian Cobras, now known today as Mickey Cobras. The Clovers and Chaplains was still a very large gang, but the Clovers took a big hit from the police raid in 1957 through 1958. The 7 Vice Lords were entering this world on the streets of North Lawndale, where there were several gangs that had combined membership into the thousands. Some gangs like Clovers, Cobras, and Chaplains had hundreds of members each. The Vice Lords knew that they would have a challenge facing off with all these other gangs, but they were still determined to preserve their existence on the streets. This is where the story will ramp up a bit and the Vice Lords would start taking out different gangs. Once Pep got out, he took in some close friends from the streets. The Vice Lords now had 11 guys in their gang and didn't recruit any more non-gang affiliate members for the rest of the year. In order to attract attention, the guys hosted dances, threw parties, and attracted women to their gang. But at one party, the Vice Lords ran into 4 members of the Clovers and a fight started. The Vice Lords beat up the 4 Clovers until they ran away. But then a while later, 50 to 60 members showed up and attacked the Vice Lords, who were severely outnumbered. The Vice Lords fought well and escaped the party, but couldn't win against the larger gang. This is when they decided it was time to grow much larger. The Clovers also became one of the first enemies to the Vice Lords on the streets. The Vice Lords really wanted to take out the Clovers and needed additions to their army, but this wouldn't be possible unless they went up against a moderate-sized gang and took them out. Their first target was the Berlands, a 24-man gang that Pep picked a fight with. Over the next few weeks, the Vice Lords fought them while outnumbered 2-1 and still beat them, all up until the Berlands submitted and flipped the Vice Lords. Now the Vice Lords was about 35 members strong. Next on the Vice Lords list was the Van Dykes, which was a war that lasted 2 days. In the end, the Van Dykes leader found out his own brother became the Vice Lords vice president, and he wouldn't fight his own brother. That's when the Van Dykes flipped the Vice Lords by the end of 1958. This is when now the Vice Lords became a well-known gang going into 1959. During the year of 1959, the Vice Lords went at war with several gangs all at once, and this would gain them a lot of reputation in the streets. They began to war with the biggest gang in the neighborhood, which was the Egyptian Cobras, especially since the Cobras controlled most of the public recreational areas. They had the pools, the theaters, and the best parks, and they had the most girls. This drove the Vice Lords to fight them tooth and nail while they simultaneously fought with multiple other gangs. Pepolo himself would become very well known, and the Vice Lords dismantled some other small gangs, and now their numbers have reached a few hundreds. The Vice Lords were now at war with the Egyptian Cobras, Comanches, the Imperial Chaplains, and the Continental Pimps. The Vice Lords were unique from other gangs in the area as they refused to draw up alliances with other gangs and were rather antisocial with other gangs. The only way they would agree to be friends with other gangs is if the other gang would adopt the last name Vice Lord, but that of course meant that they would basically flip the Vice Lords, an ultimatum that all the gangs didn't like and refused, but most of them ended up dissolving their organizations and flipping the Vice Lords eventually. Vice Lords also had aggressive recruiting measures that they adopted back in 1959, where they would approach individuals or maybe a smaller group, whether they were already in a gang or not, and ask them, hey, do you want to become a Vice Lord? If they said they wanted to, they would make it happen right on the spot with no initiation ritual. But if they said they didn't want to, they would receive a whooping or a brutal beating, and this would go on for days at a time until they submitted and joined the gang. Gangs in the late 1950s on the west side were known to do this, but not nearly as often and as badly as the Vice Lords did. For other gangs, as long as you stayed out of their territory, you weren't forced to become a member. Plus, the Vice Lords were full of aggression and they loved to teach each other how to box. Sometimes they would even attack random guys on the street with no reason. This would be the big fight against the Chaplains. Eventually, Vice Lords were taking over the Illinois Youth Center and declared anyone an enemy that wasn't a Vice Lord. And this became especially apparent when Edwin Perry went back to the center. While inside the center, he got word that a guy of the name of Bow Chest, a member of the Imperial Chaplains, had slapped around and beat up his girlfriend in front of his sister. Pep asked which arm Bow Chest used to slap his girl with. After the youth told him which arm he used, Pep told him he was going on a weeks-long vacation and was going to bring back the arm he used to slap his girl with. After this conversation, Pep set out immediately to get revenge right after he got out the reformatory. At first, the Vice Lords attempted to raid an Imperial Chaplains party, but were beaten back as they were outnumbered. After this, the Vice Lords laid low from traveling around the west side, avoiding the Imperial Chaplains, leading the Chaplains to believe they had won. But one day, the Vice Lords got word that the Chaplains was hanging out 200 to 300 deep at the Central Park Theater, located at Roosevelt Road and Central Park Avenue. The Vice Lords marched to the theater 50 strong, but by the time they got there, all but 12 backed out. 12 Vice Lords fought with about 90 members of the Imperial Chaplains, while all of the rest sat there and watched the fight. Despite them being outnumbered 9-1, the Vice Lords were beating them back and put a good hurting on the Chaplains until they got out the theater. The Chaplains then chased the Vice Lords and caught Ren and jumped them. The rest of the Vice Lords wouldn't leave Ren behind, so they beat up Ren's attackers and decided to proceed back into the theater and take on the Chaplains yet again. This is where it gets crazy, because during the brawling, Balchester emerged, and this was the guy that was slapping on his girlfriend. As soon as Balchester emerged, Pep and McClaymore abducted him and pinned him. The two began cutting his arm off, as well as slashing him all over his body, and even his face. They also carved CVL on his back. Once they cut his arm off halfway, the police showed up and broke it all up, and Pep was arrested. Pep was then convicted and sent back to the reformatory for another life sentence. In court, Balchester had his arm sewed back on, but when word got around in the Illinois Youth Center what Pep had done, every single chaplain flipped the Vice Lords immediately, which nearly flipped their whole entire gang in 1959. The Chaplains would still remain in existence after this, but as a smaller gang that didn't have much significance on the West Side streets. I don't know all the details, but Pep got his revenge on Big John for disrespecting him back in 1997 too. Vice Lords became very popular as the year of 1959 progressed. Packs of Vice Lords all over the North Lawndale took out smaller gangs, one after another, and destroying all small gangs, forcing them to flip. Many youngsters also began to admire the Vice Lord's style of wearing the all-black cape and gold lettering. Plus, they wore one earring placed in one ear before it became popular for men to wear earrings. The Vice Lords became a serious force to be reckoned with and began to spread fear all over the neighborhood. They dismantled the Bandits and the Spanish Courts, which was not a Spanish gang, and then they exercised a curfew for other gangs on the street. And if any other gang was out after 9 p.m., they were severely beaten. Only Vice Lords could roam the streets at night, nobody else. This display of sheer power gained the Vice Lords more momentum and was making them graduate to becoming the kings of the streets. They went wherever they wanted and didn't feel the need to claim any territory like other gangs did. One day they were hanging out in one area, and the next day they were hanging out in another area, making it very hard for the police to track them down. They had no respect for other gangs. They were aggressive dogs that didn't quit. The Vice Lords only had one location for meetings back in 1959, and that was at the location of 2135 South Millard, which was in the North Lawndale neighborhood. In the year of 1960, Pep got out of juvenile once again, and now he was 17 years of age. He got word that one of the top lieutenants from the Vice Lords, named Possum, had flipped to a morphine. And after failed negotiations to get Possum to flip back to a Vice Lord, Pep intensified the ongoing war they had started after he got locked up. And all through the winter of 1960, the Vice Lords kept coming at the morphines until they finally surrendered, including Possum. They all joined the Vice Lords, and the Morphines was no longer a gang. Next on the list for the Vice Lords to take out was the Braves. The Vice Lords were sick of the Braves messing with the young Vice Lords, and now it was time for payback and domination. The Braves were a big gang, and they were located in the ABLA projects and the Henry Harner projects, which was located on the west side of Chicago. After a 3-month war, the Vice Lords destroyed the Braves, and this only left one big gang left, which was the Egyptian Cobras. The Vice Lords spread all throughout the North Lawndale community in the year of 1960. And now since they destroyed the Braves, they started to branch off to the west side and even the East Garfield Park area. The Cobras were fierce competition and wanted to claim all of the North Lawndale neighborhood. Plus, from Pulaski Road all the way down to the east end, but this was now Vice Lord territory. The Vice Lords wanted the Egyptian Cobras to completely leave the west side of Chicago entirely, especially since the Vice Lords now had dominance over the west of Pulaski and K-Town. After giving an ultimatum in 1960 for the Cobras to leave, the Cobras turned it down and a big brawling war happened. This caused Pep to stab one of the lieutenants in the neck. The lieutenant then called the police on Pep. Unfortunately, this time Pep was tried as an adult, being only 17 years old, and was sentenced to 6 months in Cook County Jail. After Pep got locked up, the Cobras were beating back on the Vice Lords, which led to the death of Didi after the Cobras shot him with a high-powered rifle during a brawl. Didi was only 16 years old and was a leader of the younger members of the Vice Lords. After the death of Didi, Pep was enraged and told the fellow lords that when he got out, the Cobras better be softened up. The Vice Lords listened well and shot Stump Daddy's brother, Popeye. The crazy thing about this is Stump Daddy was a Cobra leader. They also gave Hershey Foster, another Cobra, a concussion, and they killed another Cobra leader, Leroy Brown, stabbing Leroy Brown 40 times. The Vice Lords then kept hitting the Cobras hard until Pep got out. The Cobras was indeed softened up and backed off. While Pep was locked up, the Imperial Chaplains tried to reassemble and began growing again. This angered Pep and the Vice Lords, so they stormed the dance being held at the YMCA. The Vice Lords trashed the building, breaking windows and destroying everything in sight. The YMCA then called the police on the Vice Lords and Pep. In the meantime, the Vice Lords stormed the pool hall in Franklin Benjamin Park on 4320 West 15th Street. They tore apart the pool room and burned the furniture. They then advanced on a nearby restaurant and caused problems over there. After all this, Pep was arrested and put back in Cook County Jail again. This time the judge gave him a 1-year sentence, hoping it would stop the Vice Lords dead in that track. The judge was wrong though. While locked up in the juvenile portion of the jail, Pep was wild and fighting all the youths. He got thrown in isolation multiple times until authorities decided he was too much for that section and put him in with the adults. Listen to this though, while he was in there, he was confronted by an older guy that tried to bully him. Pep ended up beating this man on 3 different occasions and gained respect and a reputation on the adult side. He ended up doing all the jobs he wanted to do in jail and had his Vice Lords running it all. The Vice Lords were well taken care of. They had the best food, the best clothes, and the best sleeping arrangements. This caused more gang members coming in to flip the Vice Lord so they could get the best treatment. And it also made them big on the street because when these members got out, they was Vice Lords now. Edwin Perry, who was a Vice Lord leader, had so much power that he was able to escape the jail by slipping out the front using a disguise without anyone knowing about it. He also got Pep out too. He found a Vice Lord that looked just like Pep. The Vice Lord started to dress like Pep and act like him for 3 months straight. The guards somehow never noticed that Pep was gone, and the man was released when Pep's sentence was over. Not a word was ever said. The Vice Lords ran the jail. They would have the staff write messages on their backs and would tell them to remember certain information. Most of the jail and prison staff cooperated because they lived on the west side and didn't want to be terrorized by the Vice Lords. In the year of 1961, Pep was out of jail and he found that the nation was in very good shape, as a guy of the name of Sugar Cane made things more organized than ever. The Vice Lords were making a lot of money now as they set up a lot of different hustles, like offering protection to storefronts, restaurants, and drug dealers. Many Vice Lords did armed robberies too, or had girls steal clothes from department stores so they could sell it on the streets. The Vice Lord leadership were even the ones to consult with potential business owners that wanted to open up on the west side. This brought them competition with the Italian organized crime that usually ran the underworld of the city, including black ghettos. The crazy thing about this is this led to an assassination attempt on Pep at the Miller Street Clubhouse. An unknown gunman came knocking at the door on October 2nd, 1961. He immediately shot a Vice Lord chief named Glenn Miles in the chest, killing him instantly. Everybody knew that the bullet was meant for Pep, and the Vice Lords knew that the Mafia had put out a hit for stepping all over their operations. The police arrived at the crime scene and found 6 automatic weapons, shotguns, and 2 30-30 scope rifles. And unfortunately, Pep got arrested right away. Police said the vice lords killed their own member and investigated other vice lords. This incident caused the vice lords building of their own organized crime racket to falter as they feared of another mafia hit. Vice lords began to focus on quicker ways to make money after the failed syndicate activities. They started to open up their own auto theft operation. They had a box full of keys and could steal just about any car in the neighborhood. In one incident in 1961, the vice lords kept beating up the Egyptian Cobras and the Imperial Chaplains anytime they saw them on the streets. The vice lords used to strip the sweaters from them, saving a few hundred of them, until one night they crashed their party that the Cobras and the Chaplains were throwing. All of the vice lords were wearing the sweaters, disguising themselves as the Cobras and the Chaplains, until suddenly they started beating the Cobras and Chaplains. The vice lords shot out the ceiling lights with shotguns and threw the jukebox down the stairs. After this incident happened, all the Imperial Chaplains flipped the Vice Lord, and they became the first separate branch in Vice Lord history as the Imperial Vice Lords. This would be the first of many branches to come, but now the Imperials were part of the overall Vice Lord nation. In the years of 1962 and 1963, the Vice Lords abandoned their syndicate operation after Glenn Miles was killed. During this time, while the Vice Lords were starting to slip a little and focus more on the Egyptian Cobras, a guy by the name of Gene Brown broke off and formed his own gang called the Roman Saints. The Saints became very popular, but the Vice Lords were always tougher, causing the Saints to team up with the Cobras. But it didn't do the Saints much good since the Vice Lords still had their numbers. In the year of 1964, the Vice Lords began to go through some changes. The organization now numbered in the thousands, and it was now impossible for Pep and the top leaders to control the whole gang. This is when Pep stepped down as an active leader at the age of 21 and spent more time with his family. He would still act as a behind-the-scenes leader, but he was not the main man anymore. It was decided one night at the pool room that 29-year-old Alfonso Alfred would take that role. Alfred joined the Vice Lords very late in life, not joining until he moved to Chicago from another state in 1962 at the age of 27. Now at the age of 29, he became the new leader. The Vice Lords looked up to Alfred as he was charismatic, tough, and quick-tempered. Alfred would do activities with the Lords, taking them places and spending money on them. In 1964, the Vice Lords would begin hanging out on the south side of the city with the Blackstone Rangers as the two organizations formed a tight alliance. And even though they had a new leader, it was still impossible for him to directly lead all these young Lords all over the west side. During the mid-1960s, this is when everything was switched. The older top Vice Lords were hanging around the time of 1964 in July, when some younger Vice Lords were coming around talking about how they were smashing rivals. But these rivals were already beaten to a pulp and asking for mercy. And there was nothing much more to do in the neighborhood but to be big and bad. This is when the older guys came up with the idea based upon how they were seeing the destruction and damage they had committed on their community. The top Vice Lords came up with an idea after some debating. This idea was to open legitimate businesses and work on bettering the community. This was a major breakthrough for the Vice Lords on that night. They had once again became conservative Vice Lords. In the year of 1965, George T. Sims Jr. was appointed commander of the Fillmore District and was the first black commander of that district as well. The older Vice Lords used this appointment to their advantage to further their new direction. The Vice Lord leader wanted to speak with Sims, informing him about the new direction and for suggestions to steer the youth away from crime and gangbanging. After this, the streets of North Lawndale began to slowly improve. In the year of 1966, the Vice Lord's new cause was to bring more positivity attention, as they began to work very closely with their once enemies, the Egyptian Cobras, the Black Peace Stones, and the Black Disciples. This was all on bettering the community and putting an end to the violence. In the summer of 1966, Martin Luther King came to Chicago and stayed in the North Lawndale neighborhood to protest that year for the riots. Martin Luther King planned on marching through mostly white areas on the south side of Chicago in the protest. The Vice Lord's Disciples and Stones were ready to march alongside of Dr. King. But after a remark was overheard by one of Dr. King's men saying they didn't need any gangbangers to help, Edwin Perry gave one quick hand signal and all the gangs dispersed and withdrew aid. But later that same night, Dr. King said he didn't support that statement, and the Vice Lords and their allies marched with Dr. King that day. After this march, the Vice Lords started to get major attention that summer, as groups were coming to North Lawndale to speak to the Vice Lords and admire their progress. Everyone was coming to their new clubhouse house located on 36th and West 16th Street. The vice lords scraped all the money they got from hustling over the years and pooled it together to open up that pool room. This became the first legitimate conservative vice lord building in history. Leading off the year of 1967, Chicago was hit hard with a terrible snowstorm. This blizzard was so bad that it left most of the city buried. Cars couldn't even move about in the city, which provided a perfect lawless environment for the young vice lords. In the mid-60s, older vice lords struggled to contain younger lords, and this blizzard made it much worse, as now the younger lords had a blast ripping off the stores. They were stealing, looting, and burglarizing the Jewish-owned businesses, and some of the older vice lords even got into the action. The problem with this is it drew negative attention to the vice lords and drove out more business owners out of the neighborhood even after the winter was over. But this would turn into positive after Commander Sims had arranged a meeting with the vice lord leaders and discussed how to prevent chaos. But these next set of events would be the downfall of the vice lords, because in the month of November of 1969, Bobby Gore, who was the conservative vice lord leader, was taken away in handcuffs and accused of murder. He then went through a very brief trial in 1970 that didn't go his way. The system was completely against Bobby and he was convicted of murder, but this would later be overturned in 1981. The vice lords continued to attempt positive changes in the year of 1969 and 1973.
What I'm saying, man, the things that we're doing to each other, we can't have it no more. What we need is a stick across our backs, because we ain't woke up and really saw where our problems are, man, and we still running around here bickering.
The worst case that happened was when Edward Taylor, a conservative vice lord member, was convicted for murdering a nun in 1969. Once Bobby Gore was convicted of murder and David Darley moved back to the east, the spotlight was back on the vice lords, and the vice lords began to engage in criminal behavior again. Plus, an original member and co-founder, Leonard Calloway, was convicted of murder in 1970 for taking down a conservative vice lord leader. Plus, a lot of other top vice lords got arrested too. And after these events happened, the vice lords went back to criminal activity and had no structure in their community. And as of today, you know vice lords have no direction, and it's just kill or be killed.
It's up for me, but I can get a gun anytime I want.
You got a gun now? Show it to us. Kenny? Okay, now what is that?
It's a 25 automatic.
25 automatic?
Yeah.
Would you ever use it?
Yeah.
But there's so much more to this video that I can get into after 1972. I'ma just save that for a part 2. But make sure you like or dislike, comment, and subscribe, and let me know down in the comments what y'all want to see next. And as always, stay blessed and stay well. Yeah, I'm out.